Welcome.
Hey. Hello,
Great
everyone.
to see you. Hi. So here we have Frank and Marissa. Marissa, this is Daria.
Hi.
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 Sorry I'm late.
No, you're perfect. I'm perfectly on time, Ellie. Welcome.
Hi.
I'm so happy to see you all. So a brief introduction to everybody, and then we can get started for our attendees as well. So we have Marissa, Frank, Daria, and Ellie. I hope you can all see one another. I believe for Ellie and I, it's 9 a.m. Frank and Daria, it's 3 p.m. Marissa, it's 2.
Oh, yeah.
What I was saying before is that Frank is a francophone. So he understands quite a lot of English, but after you are speaking in the open session or intervening, in our shared panelist chat, I will write sort of summaries and clarifications for Frank. So please don't be distracted by a lot of French text appearing there. It's not something else. It's just making it sure that we can have a good discussion throughout. Okay?
Asha, are you translating my presentation? Are you translating?
Yeah. So for each of you, when you're speaking or showing materials or anything like that, I will write little notes in the chat. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to send what I'm going to say?
It would be, I can do it in the live. It's okay. It would be helpful, but not necessary. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you though, Marissa. So now that we're all here, I guess we can get started. I said 9 sharp, and I don't want to take away all of your time. So I know there's been quite a few of you in the webinar who've been very politely sort of sitting over there on the side of our attendees. So thank you. Welcome to this webinar, Unionizing the Precarized, Syndicalism in the Contemporary Working Class. We are going to begin with something called a territory acknowledgement. This is typically done in meetings in Canada. It's done to start in a good way and in good relations, and to confront our place from which we're speaking, as well as center sort of histories of colonialism that might be relevant for the topics under discussion. So in an online meeting, that changes things quite a bit. Because, as I said, some of us are in Canada and Sweden and Morocco and in the United Kingdom, but I don't think changes things in a bad way, actually. Can make it quite more interesting. So the territories implicated are just broader. We're talking about Tuareg territories, Sami territories, Amazigh territories, and in addition to Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Anishinaabeg, and Mississaugas of the New Credit here in the Toronto area where I'm speaking from. And the international relations between these Indigenous nations here are governed by something called the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. It's an old treaty from 1701, before colonial state presence. It was between Indigenous nations. And that treaty is about access to territory, rights and responsibilities in that territory, and peaceful coexistence. And we do these kind of acknowledgements that center where displacements and dispossessions and exclusions from rights start to begin. And I think it's very, very relevant for our discussions even today, and the exclusions from labor rights that we're talking about in the groups we have present with us today. We're very fortunate to have present with us today. So this session will be a part of the regular REMESO seminar series, where we feature critical research, presentations by panelists, unionists, and I really encourage you to look up the Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity, and Society at Linköping University online. Throughout the session, you'll be able to issue questions to the panelists on the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom, and I will make sure to keep an eye on these questions and collate them in a good way. Yeah, we are so fortunate to have with us these 4 panelists. I'm really grateful for all of you being here. In no particular order, we have with us Ellie Adekour, a syndicalist, sex workers advocate, and organizer with the Art of the Resistance and Maggie's Toronto. Daria Bogdanska, graphic novelist, restaurant workers' rights activist from Malmo, Sweden, and Marissa Begonia of the Voice of Domestic Workers, a affiliated union based out of London that advocates for the more than 16,000 domestic workers in the United Kingdom, for their rights, for an end to kafala-style visas, oppressing their working conditions, and Frank Kamara joining us from Morocco, who is the General Secretary of the Democratic Organization of Workers, immigrant section that enrolls specifically migrants into their union, and works in a wide range of different issues and areas all over Morocco. So I don't want to take too much out of myself and time for myself to make sure we go into our very interesting panelists, but a brief sort of idea behind the session. And implicated in the title is that these 4 different very interesting activists and unionists work to enroll people into rights who are often marginalized in rights. And they're marginalized in rights because of the nature of their work, of the nature of their movement through their work. Not everybody is necessarily a migrant in each of these organizations. And a lot of those who can be and have been excluded from rights, and these organizations seek to defend as workers, are making those claims specifically on those grounds. So it's not about vulnerability, but recognizing contexts that are producing vulnerability. And that's why we talk about precarized. This is work, and in various different ways, we're not talking about exit organizations, be it Maggie's or the Voice of Domestic Workers. We're talking about being able to do your work in dignified conditions that are extended to everybody working in a given territory. And that's the only criteria we can have for the kind of peaceful coexistence that would be required. So, as I said, there are much more interesting things that I'm sure we're going to hear from our panelists. I will just briefly take some time to summarize this in French, and then we'll move into our panel presentations, after which we'll have a more open discussion forum where we'll have moderated questions for our different panelists, and that I hope very much we'll have multiple people engaging with. And throughout this session, while panelists are speaking in the discussion session, you're more than welcome to add suggestions for the questions into the Q&A function. Brièvement en français, bienvenue tout le monde, merci pour nous joindre aujourd'hui ici à cet séminaire syndicalisé, unioniser les précarisés, le syndicalisme et la classe ouvrière contemporaine. Nous sommes fortunés d'avoir ici membres des organisations syndicalistes, des travailleurs domestiques, travail de sexe, travail en restauration, et aussi les organisations qui en général recrutent les ouvriers migrants. Typiquement, ces réunions en Canada commencent avec une reconnaissance de la territoire. Mais en vue que nous sommes ici représentants de Maroc, Angleterre, la Suède et... mes excuses, qui est le 4e? Voilà. Canada. Oui, bien sûr, Canada. Et nous avons l'avantage de rendre compte de la taille des territoires qui sont impliqués, la taille des Samis, Touareg, Amazi, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Anishinabeg et bien sûr Mississauga de la Nouveau-Credit. Tous eux qui compris cette région autour de Toronto sont certainement, et nous aussi en tant que migrants et colons, impliqués dans le traite et les accords de un plateau, une cuillère. Peut-être pour préciser, cet plateau, le sens est de partage, coexistence, accès aux droits et aux ressources. Et tous ces organismes ont revendiqué les droits des ouvriers, revendiqué les droits des êtres humains, ce sont membres qui rendent en vie ces droits. Merci pour nous joindre ici et une brève présentation de notre 4 panélistes. Nous avons Marisa Begonia, la directrice de la Voix des travailleurs domestiques basée autour de Londres, Daria Bogdanska, romancier graphique, Elie Adecourt, syndicaliste des travailleurs du sexe, et bien sûr Franck Camara de l'ODT Maroc, Organisation démocratique des travailleurs immigrés. Merci vous tous pour nous joindre et on va partir en présentation des panélistes. So, Ellie, if you wouldn't mind starting us off in a good way.
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellie Adeker, and I work with an organization in Toronto called Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. I thought I'd maybe tell you a bit about Maggie's and the work that we do like locally in Toronto, and then maybe some of what we've been organizing around the pandemic and our response to COVID-19, because it's had quite a devastating effect on local sex workers. And then maybe a bit around like some of our labor organizing and things like that as well. So Maggie's is one of Canada's oldest by and for sex workers' rights organizations. And so sort of as Ash was describing in the beginning in the intro, we're not an exit organization. And that's something that's very important and makes our work very unique. Like we're not pushing people to exit sex work. Instead, we're recognizing the fact that sex work is a legitimate and a valuable form of labor, and that sex workers deserve fair working conditions, they deserve protections in the workplace, and they also deserve spaces to come together and advocate for our rights and for our freedoms. And so Maggie's was founded in 1986 or so in a local context in Toronto. The important thing to sort of understand about sex worker organizing is that a lot of our issues actually intersect with a lot of other local politics, right? Issues of policing and anti-Black racism. I'm sure many of you are from all different parts of the world, but one thing that I hope you would have heard of is the global uprising for Black Lives Matter, happening in a number of different cities and countries around the world. That's something that's like deeply central to sex workers' rights. We also struggle with issues of like gentrification and displacement from our communities because of the work we do. And so Maggie's as a space initially was sort of started as a space to sort of bring sex workers together. One, to just communicate about like best practices on the job, tips and tricks to stay safe, for example. But I think also grew into something much bigger than that, which was a body to advocate for the social and the political rights of sex workers in the city. And so in that time, we're based in an area of the city in Toronto, our downtown East End. And so this is an area of Toronto where there are high levels of poverty, high levels of crime, homelessness. A lot of our shelters are located in this area. There's also heavy policing in the downtown East End as well. And this is where a lot of street-based sex work is concentrated in our community. So it was important for us to be located like right in the heart of the city, in the heart of our community where sex work is happening. We do things like street outreach. So we hand out safe sex and drug use supplies to people that are working the streets. And I think that, harm reduction and our work doing harm reduction is very important. And I think really emphasizes the difference between an organization that says, you must leave sex work in order to be respectable or to deserve respect or dignity, versus an organization that will come to your corner, to your doorstep and say, what do you need to do this work safely? And we got you, right? That it makes such a difference in the lives of sex workers, just to be recognized as legitimate workers, and not even just as like legitimate workers, but to recognize the fact that sex work is, beyond just like legitimate and real. In a lot of sex worker organizing spaces, our slogan is like, sex work is real work. But really, beyond just like real work, it's valuable work. It's valuable work that there is a demand for, that people find, there's a wide range of experiences, right? People find it fulfilling and exciting, also challenging and frustrating, as we do many other like vanilla jobs, right? So a wide range of experiences. within the industry. But Maggie's as an organization has always sort of existed to bring our communities together across industries. So today, fast forward 2020, we still do a lot of our harm reduction work. We do a lot of street outreach for people. Obviously, with the pandemic in Toronto, we just got put on lockdown for a second time. So this has really sort of devastated a lot of sex workers across industries. We've had to really get creative and expand the work we do to make sure that, through the pandemic, in a Canadian context and locally, one of the issues we're seeing is that, we're being expected to go on lockdown, but many people are being denied access to emergency aid and benefits, especially sex workers, right? Because of the criminalized nature of the work. And so we've had to kind of step in and try and intervene to provide as many community supports as we can. So it's like fundraising, for example, and just doing like direct grants. And, it's a really complicated question on our end around like how and why sex workers really aren't able to access a lot of like government and emergency aid, right? Especially because at Maggie's, the work we do with sex workers really varies, right? We do a lot of work with street active sex workers who are full service sex workers, but you also have to keep in mind that like there's a huge spectrum of what counts as sex work. We have a very deliberately broad and inclusive banner of what counts as sex work, right? Everything from exotic dancing to cam modeling, all the way to full service sex work that you might, you see very glorified versions of it on TV with like high-end call girls, or the very like grim depictions of it on like Law and Order and crime shows of like street active sex workers. So we serve the range of people. And one of the things I think that we see quite a bit is that, because of how sex work is policed in Canada, because of how it's criminalized, in a very unique way, it makes it very difficult to advocate for sex workers as workers, right? So in Canada right now, sex work is regulated under a bill called Bill C-36, and the title, it's the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And I think even just in the title there, you really sort of start to see like the very unique language that gets used to sort of like the paternalistic language, right? Like we're protecting you. We need to save you. We need to bring you out of this heavily exploitative industry. And so even when we are, even when our communities are being policed or being locked up, it's all happening under this guise of like, well, we're saving you. We're saving you and we're protecting you. And it's like, obviously you are not, right? So Bill C-36 in Canada, and Asha, please jump in if I'm just like blabbing on and talking and pass my time. But Bill C-36 in Canada is sort of structured and purported to go after like buyers, right? Like clients of sex workers, like online platforms that like facilitate the sale of sexual services. And politically, this was a massive talking point for like the Conservative Party, most liberals too, right? To kind of like, well, we're not criminalizing sex workers, we're just criminalizing people who exploit sex workers, right? But the reality is, right, if a cop can come in and like when I'm on a job and like bust my client, right? That's not like when you criminalize any aspect of sex work, you make the entire industry more dangerous, right? And it's at Maggie's, as an organization that is not an exit industry, we take the position that, sex work is not inherently dangerous. Sex work is not inherently bad. Sex work is not inherently immoral or degrading, right? Those are values that people bring into and put onto sex workers to create those conditions, but not something that inherently exists within the industry, right? And so because a lot of our laws and the legal regulation of sex work is really structured under this like very like highly moralistic, like paternalistic form of like saviorship, a lot of the times it's very difficult because when our communities are out here struggling, unable to apply for emergency aid due to like in the midst of COVID because you risk losing your housing if you're outed as a sex worker, you risk losing custody of your kids, right? Not to mention the stigma and the isolation you face with like friends and family, depending on, how progressive or not progressive their values are, right? So it's very challenging. And in the context of like work and labor organizing, also thinking about the fact that like sex work as the term encompasses so many different areas of work. When you think about strip clubs or massage parlors in our city, these are like not only are they legal industries, they're also regulated and licensed industries by the city. And so when we talk about strippers or people working in massage parlors, these are sex workers that are working in different conditions and very much are, we pay licensing fees to the city of Toronto, for example, every year to be able to do your work. And yet, when you come forward expecting good working conditions, trying to advocate for fair working conditions, you're laughed out of the room because of the stigmas associated with sex work. And so I think that, in terms of labor organizing and workers' rights, sex workers do face very unique challenges because of some of these stigmas associated with the work. If you think that any form of work is inherently degrading or moral, right? Trying to do labor organizing around that and trying to assert your rights as a worker is next to impossible, right? Because you're not even given the dignity or respect at the table to be seen as a worker to negotiate with in the first place, right? And so that's so in terms of Maggie's as an organization, we're really focused on bringing communities of sex workers together. We're very much a buy and form model. Thinking more about how when sex workers come together, what is it that we can do to improve our working conditions? And I know I'm kind of tripping on the end of my time here, but maybe I'll just make some really great examples of sex worker labor organizing right now. There are a series of stripper strikes that were launched across the United States by Black strippers specifically, thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement in mind. And so there are very great examples of what it looks like when sex workers do come together and do assert their powers as workers that I think we all can learn from. And maybe I'll just end it there. Sorry, Asher.
No, you're perfectly all right for time. You can even, if you want, take 5 minutes more or end here as you like.
Oh, I didn't realize I had more time.
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay.
You're okay.
Okay, I mean, the last thing that I'll say is that, because of the wide range of forms of sex work that exist, at Maggie's, obviously we're one thing we're focused on a lot right now. Strip clubs were recently closed and opened and then closed again due to the pandemic. And in local media, there was always been quite a bit of hysteria around strippers and sex workers as super spreaders of disease, right? It's a narrative that was put onto sex workers so much, right? Sex workers as vectors of disease. It's really gross and disgusting. But we've been doing this work since the 80s in Toronto, and the interesting thing that we've found, I mean, it's not so interesting if you're a sex worker, but there's no one more invested in public health and personal hygiene and health than sex workers whose livelihoods and work literally depends on it. And so we've been doing a lot of advocacy at this level, trying to push back against these very degrading narratives of sex workers, particularly exotic dancers and people working out of massage parlors, for example, because they've been sort of the target for a lot of that hostility politically. But, so on one end, it's you're doing this advocacy for legal, licensed, regulated areas of sex work. And at the same time, when we think about some of the struggles that other areas of sex work and sex workers are going through, our work, the work ranges so much, right? A few years ago, we were organizing search parties, right? For sex workers, street active sex workers had literally gone missing, right? Gone missing and had been murdered. And it was on Maggie's and on other sex workers in our community to literally go to Toronto police. This was one very particular case I'm talking about. Her name is Laura Wells. Because Maggie's is a meeting space for so many sex workers in our community, when we disappear, when people go missing from those spaces, we notice, right? We notice and we care. And that's more than local, we can really say about local police. We've had to literally organize our own search parties, put up our own flyers to go look for our friends, for our family members that have gone missing. And have also been murdered, right? By police. Police violence is quite a big issue in Toronto's downtown East End as well. And it's quite difficult, right? I think that when we're talking about workers' rights, labor organizing, or really any form of political action, sex work is a very good example of how an entire community, while going through just undescribable forms of violence and loss, right? When your friends go missing, right? When you report these experiences of sexual violence or police violence, right? Violence at the hands of the state. So you go through this unspeakable form of violence, but then you're not even given the dignity, right? You're not even given the respect right? From like, whether it's like political leaders or like faux feminists, right? That like believe in like women's rights, but then like sex workers and trans women just don't count as part of that definition. You're not even given that dignity or respect to be able to like seek solidarity from other communities. So when Alora went missing, we had to advocate for her. We had to organize our own search parties. We had to put that own pressure on while her own friends and family were still grieving this loss, right? So it's everything from like trying to advocate to like local political leaders for sex workers, like labor rights and literal strip clubs, massage parlors, to like literally organizing these kinds of search parties, vigils, too many vigils for people in our community who have gone missing or have been murdered and are just sort of erased by the state. So, I mean, I think it's incredibly important to have buy-in for organizations because we need to be able to push back against this narrative that like sex workers need to be saved by some sort of like magical outside force, right? No, like sex workers don't need to be saved by, you know, external forces, let alone the police. Like the police do not save sex workers. That's a major source of like tension, fear, and anxiety for many people in our communities, right? We need buy-in for spaces to be able to empower each other, right? And strengthen our own political organizing and movements. And I think that is exactly 5 minutes. So now I am actually done.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you so much. I think I don't want to intervene in between each panelist, but you've given us a very good start to think about how so many of these issues are connected, particularly in relation to the coalitions that are represented in these various types of work that we're going to be hearing about today. So thank you so much. Daria, would you be so kind as to take us next?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Hey, hi guys. So my name is Daria Podomska, and I will put a stopper here. So I see how long I can talk for. I can talk for a long time. So yeah, you introduced me as a restaurant workers organizer, and this is partly true, but also there's much more to that. So I live in Sweden, but I'm Polish, and as you said, I'm also a graphic novelist. So I've been working as a restaurant worker, undocumented, and I've been trying organizing here with a union. I had some problems with organizing, getting help with the major unions, and then I got help from a smaller, more radical union, like the union called SAC, which is a syndicalist union in Sweden. And after that, I wrote a graphic novel about my experiences as a migrant in Sweden. And after that, I started working as a negotiator at my union. And today I do a lot of negotiation work, representing other workers in conflicts with bosses, representing them sometimes in legal cases. And I also work, or I am activist, helping to be a so-called external organizer. So I help people organize at work. And I think what I do is I work only with migrant workers, and especially workers with Eastern Europe, because there is quite a lot of them in Sweden. I'm one of them. And beside of that, I also sometimes write about migrants' conditions in Sweden, and the work, like the labor market, and the jurisdiction around labor market, and I debate about these things because I think that those problems are not being talked about enough, or not recognized as well. And so in my work, what I especially like what I do every day, it's mostly working with people in cleaning industry. This is mostly people from Eastern Europe, especially from Poland. I've been working a lot with agricultural workers in southern Sweden, and also with some restaurant workers, transportation logistic workers, and service workers. And this is, like you said, Asher, this is quite a precarious jobs that we quite often talk about. And something that became kind of my specialty is also, there is a lot of regulation in Sweden, and there are lots of labor laws that look very good on paper. But then when you try to apply to those kind of special kind of workers who are not always documented, who don't always have contracts, and not always, the rules are not always clear, and sometimes it's very hard to implement them. So my kind of work, starting from organizing to doing legal conflicts, it's also a lot of work with working with institutions, taxes, sometimes civil rights issues, because it's quite a lot of things involved where people need help in those cases when they don't work legally, for example. So this is what I do on daily basis as an activist. And recent years, I've been, like I said, involved in this campaign and organizing project with agriculture workers from Hungary and Romania, where we had over 30 people in our union club in one of the factories producing packing vegetables that end up on our shelves in the shops in Malmö. And last year, I've been working also with a group of Polish cleaners that have been exploited at work. And right now, what we're doing is trying to fight with a company that been exploiting them. And here comes another part of what I'm really interested in, except of organizing, is how to make companies and employers who are not serious, who are exploiting, take responsibility and pay or get legal consequences. And here it's really hard because in Sweden, there's quite liberal laws when it comes to companies and with limited responsibilities. So it's very easy for such an employer who even loses in the court to just close the company, go bankrupt, and disappear. And here we work a lot with, getting them to pay for the money that they owe to their members for their work quite often. So I've been talking only 6 minutes. What we see in Sweden, and what I see quite a lot, is that the major unions are ignoring the problem and don't have any knowledge of situation of migrant workers. And I guess like everywhere else, migration, it's always being talked about by the authorities, by the governments, by the media, but it's very seldom that the migrants get to speak by themselves. And we can see that migrant workers are very underrepresented when it comes to conflicts with employers in big unions and like labor court. And there is a big part of labor market that it's absolutely out of control of any institutions. And the big unions are really, really strict when it comes to undocumented workers and the workers that have not been members in the bigger unions. When I wanted to organize with the bigger union here in Sweden, and I didn't have like a special social security number that you could only get if you work. And I didn't have a work, so I wanted to get the social security number to be able to work. It was like some kind of catch-22 situation. So I got refused by a large restaurant union. They told me basically to get this social identification number, to get a contract, and get back to them, which my problem was. I don't have a contract, I don't have a social security number, and I'm being exploited at work, and I want to organize. So this kind of problems I've been advocating for a long time now, and bringing this to attention when I can. And here, again, the contrast of quite a strong labor law in Sweden for the Swedish workers, mostly white, and maybe of even like previous generations, who are the new labor market that's totally deregulated, is totally out of control in this situation. So there is no middle ground there. And here, this labor market where the most of migrants are employed in, sometimes it's almost criminal. I mean, this is not only tax fraud, but also housing. Like people live in really, really, really bad conditions and are depending on their employers, live in really like shacks and like small spaces. There's quite of abuse, there's quite of control. And this is something that the bigger unions are not wanting to work with. So when you work as a unionist who is actually trying to work it out and help people, it's not only union labor law, there's also all other kind of problems that you have to issue with, like housing laws and renting rights and taxes and so on. And even the institutions and police is not well educated about those problems. So they don't want to get involved in anything what's going on the labor market, because it's like they don't see it as a problem, since it's a civil agreement that should regulate conditions there. So it's quite a lot of work, and this is what we do. There is no minimum wage in Sweden. There is this system called Swedish model, where it's unions together and employers decide the minimum wages. But the kind of condition in able to decide the wages together is that there is a union active at a workplace, which is basically not existent in those kind of cleaning companies, construction sites, and agricultural work, and also many service works that migrants are employed. So there we have a situation where it's pretty much legal to pay pretty like shamefully low wages, and this is something also we're fighting for. Work environment, another thing in Sweden is just around 50 people. It's a small country, but it's around 50 people every year who die in workplaces, especially construction. So we're trying to work with that questions also when we meet our members. And we're at the moment, we're a small union, we're 3,000 members in the whole Sweden, that's 10 million people. But right now, we are one of the few organizations that work with this kind of problems. We always see every new member, like every new person who approaching to us and wants to organize or wants help with getting their wages, unpaid wages back. We never really condition it with membership. We always see each situation that individually and try to help as much as we can. We also work with education and translating material about workers' rights in many different languages, and try to work outside of the typical institutional union model, because it's what is needed right now. So it's a lot of work, and we're a small organization, but we see that things are moving, and we hope that if the other bigger unions see that it's actually possible, if you put a lot of work to it and understand the problem, and give people, and don't see people as, like you said, victims, but just like they're workers also, They're just like you. This is just a little bit different situation where you have to think about a different way. It's possible to organize every kind of worker, and it's not impossible like they say. They usually say that it's impossible to organize migrant workers, but we think it's just about approach and knowing the problem, speaking with people, believing people, and finding ways to work outside of the model that worked for 50 years ago, but it's not working anymore. You have to broaden up your work tool box, kind of. So I guess I've been talking almost 15 minutes now. So I guess that's it for now, and I'll leave word to another speaker.
Thank you so much, Daria. I think you've made some really important connections, particularly around the ecology of different size unions and where migrant workers can often fall between these advocacy cracks. For another perspective on this same issue, I'm really excited to turn now to Marissa, whose Union of Domestic Workers works a lot, inter-union collaborations, and it's interesting to see what she has to say. I understand also that she has a presentation, so we'll likely be sharing her screen with us. Please take it away, Marissa.
Yeah, can you see that? Can you see it?
Yeah, just put it on the play function down at the bottom of the PowerPoint. You should have the little sort of diaporama rather than the full screen. If you scroll to the bottom of the window, just next to this little, right at the bottom of the PowerPoint window, there's a little symbol, the fourth symbol to the right of comments. So where it says notes and then comments, you go 4 symbols over and click that. It will
notes, comments,
and then keep going to the right. No, 2 more. 2 more symbols to the right. That one. 1 more.
This one.
Yeah, this should work. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, is that working now?
Yes, excellent. Thanks, Marissa.
Okay. Hi, I'm so happy to be to join you, and thank you so much for having me. But today we join the world in solidarity on International Domestic Work, on International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Violence against women and girls is a human rights violation. Let's not just eliminate it, let's end it. So yeah, I'm Marisa Bigonia. I'm the founding member of and director of the Voice of Domestic Workers, a self-help group run by and for migrant domestic workers campaigning for our rights and welfare in the UK. Yeah. So we are affiliated to Unite the Union. We are stronger being part of the biggest trade union in the UK. And as you know, Unite is part of the TUC. And we will also work closely with the TUC at our Trade Union Congress. We are also affiliated to International Domestic Workers Federation. IDWF is our window to the world. So that's our major work. The Voice of Domestic Workers provide every Sunday classes. Every Sunday, these are the English, IT, computer, body and mind wellness, financial wellness, and media communication training. We provide emergency accommodation and basic needs for migrant domestic workers we rescued from abusive employer, and also legal advice. During this COVID-19 lockdown, The Voice of Domestic Workers has been providing food and financial support to our members who were terminated without notice and pay, and many were at risk of homelessness. Domestic workers have no access to any benefits. Our passports is stamped with no recourse to public fund, and the 80% follow of the government exclude domestic workers. So we set up a hardship fund to appeal to be able to support our members during this pandemic. Many of them have also been infected by COVID-19 because the family they work have COVID as well. And it was a very difficult situation because some of them have just to stay inside the room. They are afraid to access any healthcare because of the undocumented status. But like many fellow domestic workers, I also escaped from abusive employer and experienced different forms of abuse, from unpaid wages, long hours of work, to sexual harassment. In 2008, I was standing in front of the building of Unite the Union and asked myself what the union could do for me as individual worker. One question that I found answers the moment I entered Unite the Union. It is where I found my fellow domestic workers one by one. They were beaten, poured with hot water, starved to almost death, and worse, sexually abused. I also realized how much important it is for us migrant domestic workers to group and build our own union so we could stand together and fight together. In 2009, Justice for Domestic Workers, now the Voice of Domestic Workers, was born, and I was able to represent my fellow domestic workers as union rep in unfair dismissal cases. During our Sunday activities, we also have training being Unite the Union rep. So we are able to represent any employment case without the help or support of solicitors. So we usually settle the case outside court settlement. Through my trade union Unite and the TUC, I was given opportunity in 2010 and 2011 to represent UK's workers group in tripartite discussion, now International Labour Organization Convention 189 in United Nations Geneva, and in the high-level dialogue on Global Forum on Migration and Development in New York. In 2018, I was part of the delegation of Unite the Union at the 5th Congress of European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism. Domestic work as fourth sector of European food, agriculture and tourism, or call that EFAT. So now domestic work is now the fifth sector of EFAT, ensuring domestic workers are recognized and protected as workers in Europe. I'm proud to announce that domestic workers is set to have its own branch in Unite the Union. I think this is the first in the world. Currently in the UK, we are campaigning to reinstate the rights of migrant domestic workers, which was removed in 2012. UK has turned back to Victorian time of slavery. Sadly, this is the system we have here in the UK that facilitates abuse and exploitation of migrant domestic workers. The inability to renew visa has made domestic workers impossible to work decently and live a normal life. When this 6 months type visa system ends, this automatically criminalizes migrant domestic workers, which force them to hide underground in an unsecure job. Hostile environment that UK has been busy focusing around for many years now. Domestic workers who are already very vulnerable, working in isolation and private household as nanny to children, carer to elderly, and disabled and housekeepers are every day at risk of being arrested, detained, and deported. I prepared an audio for you to listen. These are just short. So,
knock, knock, knock. I quickly hide behind the blind of the window. My housemate opened the door. They were the immigration officers. They interrogated my housemate, then arrested her. Each time I heard someone knock at the door, my whole body would tremble. I escaped from my abusive employer and tried to live a normal life. The sight of immigration officers terrified me. But why is it? Escaping from abusive employment is a crime. My employers locked me in the hotel room with no food to eat. The maid would sexually abuse me, and the female would hit me each time she was frustrated. I couldn't take this abuse anymore. I called the reception to unlock the room, and so I fled. I thought I found a good family, but the son of this family repeatedly raped me. I thought in this country there are human rights. Where are they?
upsetting, but that's the reality of.
My employers locked me in the hotel room with no food.
No. Yeah. Yeah, it's upsetting, but that's the reality of the situation of migrant domestic workers here in the UK. Was actually since 2012 until now. Okay, these rights that we want to restore are right to change employer, right to renew visa, right to settlement, and right to British citizenship under the pre-2012 overseas domestic worker visa. I am actually the living evidence that this visa has prevented abuse and protected domestic workers as workers. I was able to fight my employment rights if I was not being paid, and I was able to report abuse. So, we also campaigned for the ratification of ILOC 189, decent work for domestic workers. We continue to organize, mobilize, and campaign to fight against injustices and discrimination and equality to ensure policies work for domestic workers. Domestic workers are not slaves, not maids, not victims, but workers with dignity. If domestic workers who look after families that are the building blocks of every nation, that allow other work sectors to work, are not recognized and respected, what kind of society we live in? I think I will leave you with that question. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Marissa. I really appreciate your testimony and the way in which you shared the testimony of your colleagues. I think there's obviously a great deal of connections of the conditions of exploitation and precarity created by the state after the 2012 change. And I see a lot of resonances. I mean, as I've been translating throughout, Frank has just written me a long update on the situation of domestic workers in Morocco. And he was very moved by some of the work that your organization has been doing and the situation of those workers. So thank you very much, Marissa, truly. So lastly, in our sort of presentation portion of the first session, we will move over to Frank Camara. This session is a little different because I'll be translating intermittently with Frank. So please bear with us, and I will turn it into from French to English as best as I can. Thank you so much. Frank, s'il vous plaît, nous sommes prêts pour vous.
Oui, je vous écoute.
Super. Nous sommes prêts pour votre présentation 10-15 minutes et je vais faire la traduction comme nous avons prévu avant.
Simultanément, oui.
Voilà. Voilà.
D'accord. OK. Merci beaucoup, Haché. Vraiment, je suis très ravi de votre invitation, de l'invitation de notre organisation ODT pour que nous puissions intervenir à cette session, à ces panels sur le travailleur migrant que nous sommes aussi. Et je suis ravi aussi d'écouter les interventions de mes sœurs qui ont les mêmes problèmes que nous ici au Maroc. Voilà.
Thank you so much. I'm very proud and happy to be here joining in this session, especially on the part of the Organization of Democratic Workers, the immigrant section here in Morocco. Thank you to my sisters who have presented before me. I see so much of the same problems that you're describing in your various organizations here in Morocco.
Notre organisation s'appelle Organisation démocratique des travailleurs immigrés au Maroc. Nous sommes le premier et l'unique syndicat des travailleurs migrants au Maroc qui a été créé en 2012 suite aux problèmes, aux situations des migrants que nous avons vécues aussi au Maroc, que je vais expliquer tout au long de cette intervention.
The Democratic Organization of Workers, Immigrant Section in Morocco is the only and first immigrant focused union in Morocco. And it was created in 2012 following a recognition of this underserved group autonomously by migrant workers looking to organize themselves.
Tout est parti de la situation des migrants que nous avons vécu ici au Maroc. Comme vous pouvez le savoir, le Maroc, avant la nouvelle politique migratoire, était un pays de transit. Donc la majorité des migrants qui venaient au Maroc, c'était pour traverser, aller de l'autre côté de la Méditerranée. Et en attendant leur traversée, ils étaient obligés de se chercher pour avoir un petit rien afin de pouvoir relier les deux bouts du mois. Et ils devraient travailler faire des petits travaux pour qu'ils puissent mieux s'en sortir. Alors, il y a eu des migrants qui ont connu des cas, et c'est à partir de ces cas-là que nous avons décidé de créer le syndicat ODT.
The environment for the creation of the union was the transition to the new migration policy and a broader transition within Morocco from being a transit country of onward migration to being increasingly fortressed by European Union funds and Moroccan assistance to have migrants staying longer and longer. Initially, it had just been the self-organization of migrants looking to make a little extra money to fund their onward journey, but now the reality of Morocco as a destination country for migration and remittance sending spurred the creation of this autonomous unionization.
Alors, tout est parti de deux cas que nous avons connus à cette époque, en 2011. Il y a un Sénégalais qui travaillait dans une usine de marbre. Il s'est vu les 4 doigts coupés. Alors, son employeur n'a pas voulu les prendre en charge. Il nous a dit que non, c'est un journalier. Il vient, il travaille le matin. Le soir, je lui paye son argent. Il part. Je ne le connais pas. Donc, le monsieur a été abandonné par son employeur. Il n'a pas voulu le prendre en charge. Alors, nous, en tant que migrants, nous nous sommes organisés pour aider notre frère afin de pouvoir suivre les traitements. Donc, cette situation-là nous a beaucoup vraiment touchés. Un mois après, il y a eu encore un autre migrant qui travaillait dans un chantier de construction. Donc, il y a une grue qui lui est tombée dessus la tête. Alors, l'ami a fait une hémorragie interne. Le soir, au lieu que son patron, quand il a eu l'accident, son patron l'amène à l'hôpital, il n'a pas voulu l'amener à l'hôpital. Il a dit non, c'est un journalier. Il n'est pas reconnu dans son travail. Donc, il vient, il travaille le matin, le soir, il rentre. Je ne peux pas les prendre en charge. Et le soir, l'ami, quand il est rentré à la maison, il a fait une hémorragie interne. Et le temps de l'amener à l'hôpital, et il est mort en cours de route. Donc, voilà les deux cas qui nous ont poussés à pouvoir mettre en place un syndicat des migrants.
The specific cases that galvanized the formation of ODTI, the union, were both in 2011. The first was a marble factory worker, a day laborer, undocumented from Senegal, who lost 4 fingers on the job, whose employer refused to assure his health condition and the consequences of his workplace injury. This resulted in a mass mobilization of workers. And one other groundswell during that time in 2011 was a construction accident where a crane injured a worker who was not taken to hospital again because he was a day laborer, who later died that evening from a hemorrhage for not being treated.
Et en plus de ça aussi, il y avait des femmes migrantes qui venaient surtout de l'Afrique subsaharienne et de l'Asie, particulièrement les Philippines, qui viennent ici travailler dans le cadre des travailleurs domestiques. Et ces femmes aussi ont de sérieux problèmes. Ils sont exploités dans leur lieu de travail, ils travaillent dans des conditions non conformes, leurs passeports ou documents de voyage confisqués, les salaires ne sont pas payés et quand ils déclarent leur salaire ou déclarent leurs documents de voyage, ils sont licenciés abusivement, ils sont même harcelés dans leur lieu de travail et tout ça nous ont poussé à aller loin, dire mais comment est-ce que le Maroc est un pays signateur de plusieurs conventions internationales des droits de l'homme, dont notamment la Convention internationale sur la protection des droits de tous les travailleurs migrants et les membres de leur famille, que le Maroc a ratifiée en 1993. Cette convention parle de la situation des travailleurs migrants en général et dans tous les pays du monde. Malheureusement, malgré que le Maroc a signé cette convention, mais certains employeurs qui emploient les migrants ne veulent pas respecter cette convention. C'est là où nous sommes partis, nous nous sommes dit non, il fallait maintenant faire en sorte que nous ayons une institution ou une organisation qui peut nous défendre en tant que travailleurs migrants.
One other principal organizational impetus and reason for the beginning of the union was the situation of domestic workers in Morocco, with very much resonance with Marissa's presentation, where recruited workers from the Philippines, from Southeast Asia, were treated and continue to be treated in deplorable conditions, with passport confiscation, exploitation, exposure to private sexual abuse and harassment, as well as non-payment of wages. The early organizing committees looked to Morocco's ratification of the Convention of the Rights of Migrant Workers and members of their families to try and push and sensibilize employers as well as the state to meaningfully enforce and apply laws that it had on the books in defense of migrant rights, particularly this transnational convention.
Et au vu de toutes ces situations-là, l'idée nous est venue, nous nous sommes inspirés de l'idéal syndical mondial qui atteste que partout dans le monde démocratique, le syndicat joue un rôle déterminant, non seulement dans la défense et la protection des droits des travailleurs migrants, mais aussi dans leur insertion au sein de leur société d'accueil. C'est comme ça que nous nous sommes dit non, il fallait que nous puissions nous organiser autour ou au sein d'un syndicat. Mais malheureusement, au Maroc, la constitution marocaine n'autorise pas aux étrangers d'avoir ou de créer leur propre syndicat. Mais néanmoins, ils peuvent adhérer ou s'affilier à une centrale syndicale marocaine. C'est comme ça que nous avons tapé les portes de beaucoup de centrales syndicales marocaines. Heureusement que l'ODT, qui est une centrale syndicale marocaine, organisation démocratique du travail, nous a ouvert grandement les portes et nous a accueillis très volontiers pour que nous puissions adhérer l'ODT centrale afin de faire partie de cette centrale syndicale marocaine et défendre les causes des travailleurs migrants.
Not only did the union form as a tool of redressing these widespread labor abuses, but also from the migrants' perspective as a tool for integration and passing into better conditions, socially included in the host society. However, the Moroccan constitution prohibits foreigners from forming a union. So the nascent group of migrant workers was forced to go union to union to union, asking to be affiliated rather than forming autonomously. Not everyone said yes. Eventually, the Democratic Organization of Workers was very, very willing to host the immigrant section of migrant laborers and allow them to get legal status, organizational resources, and legal protection, as well as a platform for which to advocate at higher levels.
Notre système de fonctionnement est vraiment très différent parce que nous avons des migrants de toutes les nationalités confondues, surtout la majorité sont des migrants subsahariennes. Et comme je l'ai dit, nous avons aussi des Philippines ou des Philippins, des Bangladais, des Asiatiques en général, et la majorité sont des migrants subsahariens qui travaillent la majorité dans l'informel, c'est-à-dire ils travaillent dans le noir, sans contrat de travail, sans protection sociale et dans les conditions inhumaines. Donc, toutes ces situations-là nous ont poussé vraiment à ce que nous puissions nous organiser pour créer une structure afin de pouvoir nous défendre vis-à-vis des institutions ou vis-à-vis de nos communautés et vis-à-vis de ces travailleurs-là. C'est comme ça que quand l'ODT centrale nous a acceptés et depuis 2012, nous nous sommes constitués en une branche ou secteur de l'ODT centrale depuis 2012.
The majority of our members are sub-Saharan, but they feature from all regions of the world, including notable contingents of Bangladeshi workers, Filipinos, and the majority being sub-Saharan Francophone workers. The majority of these workers are also working in the informal sector, without contracts, without recourse to social funds or social rights, and it makes for a very particular organizing situation within a larger union that generally unionizes Moroccan citizens.
Quand l'ODT nous a acceptés pour que nous puissions être un secteur ou une branche au sein de l'ODT centrale, nous avons eu aussi l'appui ou le soutien de plusieurs organisations marocaines et des Marocains résidant à l'étranger. Ces Marocains-là nous ont soutenus parce que, vivant en Europe, ils ont connu la même situation d'exploitation de travailleurs marocains à l'étranger. Ils nous ont soutenus, ou ils ont soutenu notre initiative, ils nous ont appuyés et c'est comme ça que, en 2012, on a décidé de mettre en place un comité au sein de notre structure syndicale des immigrés et nous l'avons dénommé Organisation démocratique des travailleurs immigrés au Maroc. Il y a eu un comité constitué de 31 personnes au sein du bureau national pour coordonner les activités de tous les migrants qui travaillent dans divers tissus socio-économiques du Maroc. Comme je l'ai dit, ils travaillent dans les bâtiments. La majorité des migrants travaillent dans les bâtiments, dans l'artisanat, dans le travail domestique, dans la pêche au sud du Maroc, dans l'élevage au sud du Maroc et les commerçants ambulants ou les revendeurs dans le rue du Maroc. Et quand vous allez parcourir le rue du Maroc, vous verrez il y a des migrants qui vendent et dans le rue, ainsi de suite, ou certains migrants qui ont des petits espaces ou des petites boutiques où ils vendent. Donc tous ces gens-là, tous ces travailleurs indépendants et ceux qui travaillent dans la pêche, l'agriculture, l'artisanat, la construction, les travailleurs domestiques, tous, on les a rassemblés et on essaye de voir comment résoudre leurs problèmes que je vais énumérer tantôt.
The organizing committee of 31 members in founding the union reached out to construction, craft, domestic working, farming, fishing, independent street resellers, with a lot of assistance from diasporic Moroccan citizen organizations who are experiencing similar conditions of oppression working in Europe, and very, very much assisted them in both formation, coordination, and setting up branches in different industries and finding local members to establish chapters.
Avant la nouvelle politique migratoire mise en place par Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI en 2013, donc avant 2013, les migrants étaient victimes de plusieurs sortes d'exactions. Il y avait des arrestations arbitraires, des reconduites à la frontière avec l'Algérie, des expulsions, ainsi de suite. Et toutes ces situations-là, ajoutées aussi aux conditions mauvaises de travail des travailleurs migrants, nous ont tous interpellés pour dire que la condition d'irrégularité dans laquelle se trouvaient les migrants à l'époque était peut-être la cause de ces exactions, était peut-être la cause de ces arrestations, était peut-être la cause de ces exploitations dans leur lieu de travail. C'est comme ça que, quand on a mis en place notre syndicat des immigrés, la première des choses était, nous vivons au Maroc, nous travaillons au Maroc, régularisez-nous. Donc la régularisation de tous les travailleurs migrants ou de tous les migrants en général était notre cheval de bataille depuis que nous avons mis en place notre structure syndicale ODT immigrés.
Before the change of Moroccan migration laws in 2013, and the first year of their organizing and establishment as a union, the first 2 years rather, conditions were very bad. Arbitrary arrests were common in workplaces, and refoulement of migrants coming to work at the Algerian border was widespread. Immediate pushbacks. Part of what they strived as a horizon was looking to the root cause of what these sorts of state and parastate abuses. So their first and principal goal was towards regularization of migrants under the sign that we are working in Morocco, we are paying tax on our work in Morocco, we are entitled to labor protections, regularize our status. And it is our irregularity that is the cause of this exposure to harm.
Voilà, donc c'est comme ça que quand on a mis en place notre comité en 2012, au mois de juillet 2012, et avant 2012, le 1er mai 2012, nous avons défilé pour la première fois aux côtés de nos camarades de l'ODT centrale. Pour la première fois, c'était une histoire énorme parce que c'était pour la première fois de voir les migrants marcher ou défiler aux côtés de leurs frères marocains. Et cette sortie médiatique des migrants dans la rue le 1er mai 2012 a fait un tollé et le message est passé, il est parti jusqu'au Conseil national des droits de l'homme qui nous a rapprochés et a multiplié des rencontres, des consultations pour connaître la situation des migrants, des travailleurs migrants. Et nous lui avons exposé, donc le CNDH, nous lui avons soumis, exposé tous nos problèmes concernant d'abord, la régularisation de tous les migrants et deux, les conditions de travail des travailleurs migrants au Maroc. Et toutes ces revendications-là, toutes nos doléances ont été prises en compte par le Conseil national des droits de l'homme.
This organizing around regularization took the form of massive migrant worker protests on May 1st, 2012, which drew the attention of the National Council of Human Rights and sparked connections between ODTI and the National Council of Human Rights, where they were able to bring up conditions of and complaints of migrant working conditions, as well as the need for regularization to avoid the dangers and risks of ongoing testimony from their members.
Et c'est comme ça que le 18 décembre 2012, nous avons décidé d'organiser pour la première fois la première édition de la Journée internationale des migrants, que nous avons organisée avec le soutien du CNDH, deux autres associations telles que GADEM, OMDH, AMDH, qui nous ont soutenus dans avec leur expérience pour que nous puissions organiser cette première Journée internationale des migrants. Et le CNDH nous a donné ses locaux pour que nous puissions organiser cette édition. Et au cours de cette édition, nous avons émis des recommandations auprès du Conseil national des droits de l'homme. Et parmi ces recommandations, la recommandation phare était la régularisation de tous les sans-papiers au Maroc. Car pour nous, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, c'était peut-être l'obstacle numéro 1 qui poussait les migrants à être arrêtés, qui poussait les migrants à ne pas être reconnus, qui poussait les migrants à être exploités. Et toutes ces exactions-là, nous avons compris que peut-être c'était dû à l'irrégularité des migrants. C'est comme ça que nous avons demandé, nous avons fait cette recommandation phare, la régularisation de tous les sans-papiers au Maroc, et le CNDH a pris compte de cette recommandation. Pourquoi vous verrez dans le rapport que le CNDH a soumis à Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI le 9 septembre 2013, le nom de l'ODT est mentionné dans ces rapports pour dire que l'exemple de l'ODT était un exemple à suivre parce que nous nous sommes décidés d'accompagner les migrants dans leur lutte pour le droit des travailleurs migrants.
This collaboration with the National Council of Human Rights proved extremely effective by jointly agreeing to organize the first marking of the International Day of the Migrant in December 2012. And the process leading up to this allowed recommendations from ODTI for a full regularization of all undocumented workers in Morocco to enable access to social rights, claims to medical assistance, etc., became part of the state bureaucracy's recommendations, so part of the National Council of Human Rights recommendations, which were then taken to the King, Mohammed VI, and became part of the policy advocacy already in early September, looking back to ODTI.
Voilà donc, ça c'est notre première revendication dans le cadre de nos plaidoyers. Comme je l'ai dit, l'ODT Travail immigré a été créé pour conclure un peu en bref, a été créé pour défendre les causes des travailleurs migrants qui étaient exploités et qui continuent à être exploités dans leur lieu de travail. Nous avons eu comme recommandation première la régularisation de tous les travailleurs migrants au Maroc. Nous avons été écoutés et Sa Majesté a pris bonne note du rapport du CNDH et il a donné ses instructions, ses autres instructions pour que les migrants puissent régulariser. Et il y a eu les deux phases de l'opération de régularisation de 2014 et de 2017 où les migrants en situation irrégulière au Maroc ont été tous régularisés. Donc c'était grâce aux efforts que nous avons déployés sur le terrain pour demander cette régularisation et le CNDH nous a écoutés. Il a fait un rapport qu'il a transmis à Sa Majesté et Sa Majesté, en tant que père de famille, nous a écoutés et a ordonné ses autres instructions pour que les migrants puissent être régularisés, 2014 et 2017. Donc voilà notre premier plaidoyer, notre premier cheval de bataille, c'était la régularisation et nous l'avons obtenu. Et nous continuons toujours dans la même lignée à défendre les causes des travailleurs migrants et les membres de leur famille.
This campaign produced the results over the long timeline of transiting their social movement claims, coordinating with the national union, and arriving at the level of representation where the state bureaucracy passes to the king in two broad regularizations in 2014 and 2017, where the National Council of Human Rights report was taken up by the king and regularized some over 50,000 undocumented workers in Morocco in 2 phases. The work that they continue to do is organizing around the rights of migrant workers and members of their family, with specific reference to the UN Convention, and using that convention in a local context, both to sensibilize workers of their rights or newly arrived in the country, and employers of their obligations to under the new state policy following these regularizations and following the new direction in Moroccan migration policy as a arrival country rather than a transit country.
Nos actions, pour clôturer, nos actions aussi sont la défense, comme je l'ai dit, la défense et la protection des droits de tous les travailleurs migrants et les membres de leur famille. Nous plaidoyons aussi pour l'application et le respect des conventions internationales dont le Maroc est signateur, notamment, comme je l'ai dit, la Convention internationale sur la protection des droits de tous les travailleurs immigrants et les membres de leur famille, que le Maroc a ratifié en 1993, et que cette convention n'est pas vraiment respectée par les employeurs qui sont censés la respecter. En dehors de ça, il y a aussi le suivi que nous faisons, l'accompagnement, la sensibilisation, l'orientation des migrants en ce qui concerne la régularisation, en ce qui concerne les procédures administratives, en ce qui concerne l'accès aux services sociaux de base, donc la santé, l'éducation, la justice. Donc nous accompagnons ces migrants-là dans tout cet ensemble de situations pour les aider à mieux s'intégrer au sein de la société marocaine. Mais le même problème que mes sœurs ont soulevé, Elie, Daria et Marisa, ce sont les mêmes problèmes que nous rencontrons ici au Maroc, et eux aussi rencontrent le même problème. Alors la grande difficulté repose à la non-application et non-respect de la Convention internationale pour la protection des droits de tous les travailleurs migrants et les membres de leur famille, que d'autres pays européens industrialisés, jusqu'au jour d'aujourd'hui, n'ont pas signé.
So the principal work following regularization is conscious raising, administrative, and fighting for fighting for migrant workers and members of their families' rights, but also against non-application and situations of disregard of the laws in place, in particular the Convention of the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Family. How this works involves a lot of workshops and going around to communities, but in particular, the lag of change of policy is really evident in their organizing labor. And Frank echoed the claims and conditions and situations mentioned by Marissa, Daria, and Ellie in their presentations of non-application of laws and injudicious enforcement of laws, illegalizing certain things that are not illegalized, etc. Merci Franck pour votre intervention. C'est vraiment généreux de votre part, je l'apprécie beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, merci en tout cas, c'est moi qui vous remercie pour votre initiative afin que nous puissions nous exprimer. Il y a beaucoup de choses, malgré le temps qui nous fait défaut, mais je sais que ce genre de séminaire, nous devons les poursuivre pour essayer d'argumenter beaucoup de problèmes que nous rencontrons en tant que défenseurs des droits des migrants en général et des travailleurs migrants en particulier. Je suis ravi, comme je l'ai dit pour ne pas me répéter, donc les mêmes problèmes que rencontrent nos sœurs, ce sont les mêmes problèmes que nous rencontrons ici, mais on ne va pas baisser les bras. Notre souci, c'est que la situation des migrants puisse être prise en compte et en charge. Et surtout, pendant la période de la COVID-19, nous avons connu pas mal de problèmes de migrants qui ont été laissés pour compte. Les migrants n'ont pas été pris en charge par les autorités dans le cadre des mesures de soutien et d'accompagnement mises en place pour les personnes démunies. Comme vous le savez, les travailleurs migrants ou les migrants en général sont classés dans la catégorie des personnes précaires, des personnes vulnérables. Donc, normalement, il y a des fonds qui ont été mis en place pour soutenir ces personnes, mais les migrants ici n'ont pas été pris en charge. Heureusement qu'il y a eu des associations et des ONG marocaines qui ont essayé de venir en aide et qui continuent à le faire jusqu'à présent, de venir en aide aux migrants en leur accordant des petits dons, des kits alimentaires, vestimentaires, ainsi de suite. Donc, nous, cela, ça allait être un problème très sérieux. Nous remercions ces ONG et associations, nous aussi au niveau de l'ODT. On le fait avec des petits moyens que nous recevons par-ci, par-là. Donc, voilà, ne baissons pas les bras. C'est une situation que nous avons et nous devons continuer à défendre cette situation ou cette cause de travailleurs migrants et des migrants en général.
Merci Franck. Je vais la traduire et passer aux sessions ouvertes avec les questions. In closing, the current worry of his organizational work, echoing some of the testimony of Marissa and Ellie, is how the pandemic has affected their members, where uneven support is given to workers based on their nationality. And they're seeing a lot of risk and exposure, loss of wage, lack of government support, rising rates of homelessness amongst their members during this time. And they're very grateful for solidarity organizations that have reached out to assist with basic needs provision. We're talking about housing, food, etc. Looking ahead, there is a lot of resonance in these discussions, and a need to see them as organizational, to see them as resonances, to move forward from those common struggles and organize transnationally in the way that we can in larger platforms and raise voices of these things and find our role. And I think this is a really good moment to transition to a more open question forum for all of our panelists, where we can take questions from the audience in the Q&A or in the chat. If you want to write them, I have some that I've already received, and I will direct them as I see fit, or if you have a specific one for specific panelists, please feel free to write it in the chat. So I have someone who's raised a hand. Before I go over to Tobias, just give me one moment. I wanted to give the panel a chance. So Marissa, Daria, Ellie, and Frank, if you have any questions that you wanted to ask your colleagues, you are more than welcome. Tobias says it was an accident. Do you have any questions you want to ask your fellow panelists about something they might have said, or follow up on something for clarification? That would be more than welcome. Otherwise, I can go into some of the questions we shared in advance and that I've received.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci Franck. Merci Franck. Merci beaucoup. So I think a really pregnant discussion that we've had coming around is enforcement versus the law on paper. I heard this in everyone's presentation, that we are seeing very, very different conditions around how the law is put into practice and how it is talked about in ideal terms. So I see this in various different conditions, and I wonder how you organize around these struggles. Is it at the specific case of the person who is incorrectly enforcing or over-enforcing the law? Is it at the structural case? How do you work with sensibilizing the wider community to what they are complicit in? Je vais brièvement traduire cette question aussi, mais but if anyone would like to jump in right away, it's very, very welcome. Franck, cette première question est à propos de la différence entre application et les lois en papier, et comment nous pouvons organiser à travers ces différences au niveau local, transnational, mouvement social. I think for interest, feel free to jump in, but I'd love to start, for example, with Ellie, if you have something about this, because I think it's very present, or Daria. I think it touches very much on some of the situations that you're dealing with in your work. Cool.
Ellie, you want to start?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's a thing. Well, both reassuring to be in a room where we kind of, even though different kind of parts of world and different kind of employments, and this is the problem what we meet often, that of course the laws on the paper are not the same, not the laws that we had the possibility to implement those laws. For me, as I've been thinking a lot about this, and when it comes to union organizing, I use a lot of laws and to get people's, like, I don't know, unpaid salaries and so on. So I use a lot of legal processing, but quite often I see that the laws are not applicable or not fitting to the current situation, the new liberalized employment forms, and so on and so on. And I always have this struggle with me, inside of me, because I believe that we shouldn't focus on laws, we should focus on organizing. Because when I think about labor organizing, it's about power relations and power structures. So no laws are ever gonna protect you if you are weak. And what I mean weak is like you're not organized, you're not many, and so on. And sometimes a lot of legal discourse about workers' rights, it's about rights, and human rights and everything. And I think it's sometimes a trap when it comes down to getting as many rights, like advocating, putting a lot of work into getting rights on the paper, while then at the end of the day, it's not possible to use them because the legal system, it's built like this. It is a system built for the privileged. And even knowing it and expanding it, it's not going to solve the dispersion of the power and the imbalance of power. Yet, in many of the situations that I work with, when there is exploitation, when there is dependency on housing and many other things that the workers are depending on employer, the laws are sometimes like the only thing that you can use to get some kind of justice for the person. And of course we use it, and of course I think they're important also. So I see two things here, that you don't have to, there's many people who are either just for organizing, laws don't matter, or just for the laws, we have to focus on the laws because we cannot organize. And my standpoint here is that I believe we should definitely be advocating for laws, more strict laws, more protective laws. But at the same time, we shouldn't fool ourselves that this, at the end, somewhere, they're always going to protect us, because this is a part. It's a part of the system. And interesting thing that I find myself thinking about sometimes is the employment relation in general. How many problems that you guys talked about that are very severe and that I meet as a union organizers, when it's basically crime. It's economical crime, it's exploitation crime, it's abuse, it's not following health and safety that creates people's, they're getting hurt, they're dying, and so on. And here, I think that as much as it's important that the unions and those kind of unions like you guys are involved in are able to see the scope of the problem and use different tools and different advocacy methods, different organizing methods, like finding housing for the people who are being evicted or finding support groups. This is very important, and I think we should focus on that and make broader, union culture aware of that, so that it goes into mainstream, that we have to, fit our strategies to what's needed. So that's very important. I think I see our way working forward, we're broadening a scope of the way how we work as unions. But at the same time, I think sometimes all those crimes, they should be prosecuted and being taken seriously, because they are being seen as a part of a contractual relation. Oh, you know, you are the worker, you have the choice to come here, and it's your own fault that you're getting exploited or you agreed to pay for so low. As a civil citizen, if you don't pay your fucking bill, sorry for the language, you can get a lot of problems. But if you're an employer, if you have a company, you can get away with so much stuff and then go bankrupt and never get any responsibility. And sometimes when I work with those really complicated cases where we're like chasing an employer who did everything wrong, and it's still impossible to get them pay or get them to take responsibility for their actions, what I'm thinking to myself, I'm doing some kind of police work here. This is way beyond union organizing, and I'm proud of doing this, but this should be being taken seriously by also other authorities, and companies and employers shouldn't be allowed to, should have consequences, because I think everything is a systematic plane, you know. We have to see that some problems that are systemic, we will fight for them organizing, but they're also sometimes beyond us. And will always just recreate themselves within the system that it creates those problems. So I think I have a lot of different thoughts about it. I'm really interested to hear what you think, but that's my kind of internal conflict that, yeah, both rights, we need to fight for rights, but also we have to organize, but sometimes it's hard to organize when we are depending. But also we have to realize that we cannot do everything, and there is a need, some kind of systemic change and change of view how we look at this kind of crimes.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and Daria, thank you. I agree with so much of what you've said, and I'm also just thinking about how like sex workers are in a really difficult position with law and law enforcement, particularly in a Canadian context, largely because of that framing around like, well, these laws are actually just in place to protect you and they're in place to save you. And so it's sort of, I think that the approach has to be sort of multifaceted, because on one hand, it's like at Maggie's, we're dealing with sex workers coming in and talking about like very like deeply personal and violent experiences with police and with law enforcement specifically. And of course you have to be able to address like the immediate need and sort of like do the aid work there. And I think the second piece around also like challenging laws and sort of like engaging with like legal sectors and the criminal justice system is also very important too, right? It's why so many sex workers' rights organizations are pushing for things like decriminalization. And decriminalization talks about like the removal of like any anti-sex work laws, but also all laws that impact sex workers, because like typically it's not just laws against sex work that are applied to sex workers. It's also things like loitering and like trespassing and like drug possession and stuff like that. But I think that the important thing, and what I've learned from doing a lot of work for decriminalization, is that like when we're engaging like legal perspectives, it's also really important to push back against this very paternalistic narrative around like, well, these laws are in place, tackling like specifically targeting your clients or targeting like your networks or web platforms or managers or security guards because we need to keep you safe. And one of the ways you can push back against that is by really highlighting the perspectives of sex workers who are like, well, listen, actually, my booking agent, the person I pay to screen my clients for me, the person that I pay to drive me to and from, that's a very important and like vital part of my safety and my security. And actually, when we criminalize clients or buyers of sex work, what we do is drive them into further like unregulated spaces, right? And we remove agency from sex workers to be able to come forward and report issues, right? Like a narrative. One of the issues we deal with a lot in sex work or right organizing is the conflation of sex work and human trafficking, as if these two things are the same thing. And part of pushing back and part of pushing for decriminalization is highlighting the fact that sex work is not human trafficking. These are two distinct things. And that actually, when we criminalize sex work and we drive sex workers and clients and buyers further underground, we make things more unsafe. And that actually, if we had a legal system, I mean, not really a legal system, because I don't actually believe that laws can really like empower communities of people. It's not the role of the state or the criminal justice system. But if we did not exist in a world that criminalized any area of sex work, we would actually empower people to come forward and report issues of violence and abuse in the workplace, and empower them to do that without risking losing their kids or their housing and stuff like that. And so it's like actually the legal and political struggle for sex workers' rights is actually it's quite important in that way. But it's also in terms of like actually organizing for labor rights. Again, when you come into a space where people won't even acknowledge that what you do is work, right? This is why we always have to come back and be like, sex work is real work, sex work is real work. And it's exhausting to have to say that, but this is where we're at in a lot of political spaces, justifying that this is like a real, legitimate form of work. Because if you don't even buy into that, then of course you're not going to listen to like labor organizing perspectives from sex workers. And so there definitely is distinction between like what the laws are purported to do versus what they actually do. And I think on our end, a lot of that is really like a lot of chipping away of that is partially about engaging the legal system, and partially about coming up with new strategies around like repealing like Bill C-36, or like pushing for decriminalization, or challenging like local bylaw enforcement, and sort of like petty ticketing measures that police take. But the other part of it is also like much broader advocacy. And I think that like the thing I really liked about all of the presenters is like the talking about the power of like unions and labor organizing. And in a Canadian context, it's been very difficult to get buy-in from a lot of labor unions around recognizing sex workers as a group of people worth listening to and organizing, which is very frustrating. But at the same time, I think that like when different sectors of workers come together, we can actually improve working conditions and make things much safer for sex workers. And one great example of this in Canada and the United States, at one point, Marriott, like a global hotel chain, was training their hotel workers to spot victims of trafficking. And what that actually looked like was like looking for people, like kind of one, racially profiling people, but two, like looking for like, you know, people who were perceived to be like women sitting alone at a bar and sort of interrogating them, or like, what are you doing here, right? Or trying to follow them to their rooms. And that led to a lot of issues for sex workers. And so one great pushback against that, outside of just like challenging like the policy with the hotel, because that wouldn't actually work the chain, was going directly to the hotel workers union and being like, listen, sex workers are workers here. You as hotel workers also have a vested interest in protecting the rights of workers as well. And so establishing those relationships as well, I think was quite important. That's one example I can think of, but maybe I'll pass it off to other panelists too.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but in the UK, for domestic workers, it's zero rights. There's no rights at all. Yeah, so they all ended up undocumented. However, they created this national referral mechanism of the Modern Slavery Act and Trafficking Law. Yeah, so where I found myself why I'm very much against it, you know, for identifying migrant domestic workers as victims of modern slavery and trafficking. I also ended up in doing it. Why? Because I watched them. That's the only available in front of them. Yeah, so they are being forced to apply into this national. It's a system that identifies whether or not victims of modern slavery or trafficking. That's the way it's being. There's a way to pass it, yeah. So, but I could say that I became an expert by force as well. While I very much against it, but I couldn't really. I do it because I couldn't watch them all ended up undocumented. Well, there is a way to save the right to work, because if they apply and before they only have 6 months visa, if they apply before this visa ended and pass in the reasonable ground, then they could keep the right to work, and the leave to remain just continue automatically until the whole process completed to conclusive ground. But I think receiving conclusive ground is another difficult pass, you know. very complicated, but I have studied it, and by following my fellow domestic workers, yeah, every case I follow, I really watch it closely and learn it. Yeah, so where they've seen weak, I look at why is it weak, why so I look at how to make this case stronger. Yeah, so so far that's one way to save them from being undocumented, but it's all temporary. Yeah, and it's not really a solution because they're not really victims of trafficking. They are vulnerable group of workers whose rights have been totally swiped off. Yeah, and nothing really that protect of. But we also look at the other law, like there is an Equality Act, yeah, in the UK, where in uh, the help and safely exclude domestic workers. We could use that the duty of care of employer, but the way forward really is to continue and organize domestic or empower them, that how important it is to be in the front line of this campaign, to be the voice of their own rights. So our English classes is not ordinary English classes like you can find in the school. We use it as way to increase to raise the political awareness, the need, why is it important for them to be speaking out. So even in all my presentation, I always take them with me, their voice. So, and I always let them understand that this is your campaign. This is about you. This is for you. It is important that you are there speaking. So when we launched our campaign, I think I had also difficulties in preparing them. Like one of them would really cry all the time. Okay, stop first, rest. Until again, practice her, prepare until she could already speak out. So the English classes, the IT help prepare them. We put all their possible rights now that we can use our campaign. Why is it important to campaign, to continue to lobby the government? So I think the voice to domestic workers is one example on we could actually organize, because domestic workers are individual workers. So it's really the most difficult group of workers to organize. But I think the voice of domestic workers is one good example. And the place we have in Unite the Union is one good example, that we could build our own place within the union, but at the same time, we could be independent as one union. Yeah, so Unite actually never intervene with what we do, what we campaign, but we actually command them. Yeah, so we ask them what we need, what we want, and they do it. And I think the fact that before the lockdown, we already started to talk about, or we already settled actually the building of domestic workers branch within the union. So it's not the voice of domestic workers, but it's all domestic workers in one branch, Unite the Union, in Unite the Union. So where policy are absent, we continue, to empower domestic workers, to let them understand that they should be the one, they should be able to protect themselves by letting understand, like if we do the interview, a job interview, clear it. What time you start to work, your rest period, your salary, how much, how many hours you work, but your day off, your annual leave, and that annual leave should be with pay, or a month pay. And for them to be able to see that during the interviews, because abuse is happening not all the time because you are undocumented. It's because we allow them to abuse us. So you have to stand up, you have to speak out that these are the work conditions that is decent, that is right for you. If I deserve that, those rights, you also deserve that right. So I think it works well in terms of educating and empowering domestic workers. I think to protect themselves in the first place, yeah, while working on the policies to work for domestic workers.
Thank you so much, Marissa, and Daria and Ellie. I think the line of the discussion took a really interesting turn. We could hear about the role of enforcement, and particularly Marissa, I heard this very much in one of the testimonies that you brought up in your presentation of the fear of the immigration officials' visit to the home, and how both in yours and particularly in Ellie's organizational activities, but we could even say so in Daria's through neglect, we see like strong state complicity in these precarious conditions. I want to continue with these discussions, but as before, if anything has come up that any of the 3 or 4 of you would like to ask one another, feel free to supplant me. You know, like I have more questions. I got a long list here, but while you have the chance, okay. I'm going to take it.
I just want to say, I think while nationally we work with many other organizations to support our work, many trade unions, NGOs, and individuals, but also those MPs, like I think during our lunch, we had Jess Phillips, the MP for Birmingham, that is holding our campaign in the parliament. I think it is also important for us worldwide, to work together, especially with there are also many international law that we need each other's support. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Yeah. This is, I think, comes from a question also we have from Josie in the audience that I think connects very much to what you just said, Marissa. Like, to what degree, as I sent out to all of you before, are you trying to organize sort of with other localities across other political jurisdictions, be it in the same country or in other countries? And what do you need that you could get and that aren't getting from major unions? And what sort of tensions are around that?
Could you?
Is that a question?
Yeah, I guess I need to phrase it better. So there's 2 questions in there. Josie wants to know what you need from the big unions, how they can help. And I want to know, based on what you said, Marissa, how you are organizing across different jurisdictions. You made a little example, I think, in your presentation about the broader coalitions of domestic workers movements, DFW.
And IDWF,
Yeah.
So I know that I think I've been hearing in other countries on how the other big trade unions has treated, especially domestic workers. You know, I think Unite the Union has really made so much adjustment, like because many domestic workers have no bank account. So usually the membership is being the monthly is being deducted through direct debit, but in the Voice of Domestic Workers, we have a trade union working group. So they are actually the bridge between the Voice of Domestic Workers and Unite the Union. So we accept cash payments. So usually every month our members would pay by cash, those who have no bank accounts, but those who have a bank account, they can pay by direct debit. So that's one major change that Unite the Union, I think Unite the Union is the only one doing that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but so far that's how it works. So we pay and then we remit it to Unite the Union, and actually Unite would give us 10%. Would give us 10% of that of the money we remitted. So they give us back the 10% for the Voice of Domestic Workers. Like if a union rep need this traveling allowance to settle a case or the telephone bill. So we use it that way. Plus, I think somehow the Voice of Domestic Workers really managed to position itself. I think it's actually dual. We are both Unite, but also we are a charity. We are registered charity, so we are very independent. So in terms of, but we Unite also open its building. So every Sunday we are in Unite the Union building. we're doing the classes there. However, of course, during the pandemic, we're not able to do all these things, and it's a problem. We haven't been doing payment to Unite to their membership because we couldn't collect physically. But also, we're looking on January. I think Unite already has prepared on how we move forward with all those unpaid membership fees. So I don't think so. They will ask the domestic workers to pay the whole year. Yeah, but I think moving forward from where we will begin after this lockdown, which we don't know when. Yeah, but in terms of our campaign, Unite the Union has big support. Plus the fact that Unite is our backdoor to Labour Party. So, there's a conservative party, which is the current government, but the opposition Labour Party. So, it's our rights of migrant domestic workers is always in the manifesto of Labour Party. So, that's one thing. But also, Unite connects us internationally through ITUC, yeah. And yeah, so that's where I always, in terms of domestic workers, I always represented my trade union in international and European level. Now, in terms of International Domestic Workers Federation, the one in the EFAT, we started that together with IDWF, to include domestic workers as fourth sector in European Federation of Food, Agriculture, and Tourism, then domestic work. So that's we managed to achieve that in 2019. Yeah, and domestic work is now the fourth sector. But also, it connects us around the world in organizing domestic workers around the world. Yeah, so because IDWF is international, so sometimes we would go to if a panel event is being discussed in the Philippines, so we would go there and organize and help organize domestic workers there and set like the Voice of Domestic Workers. I think is a good example of unionized, organized domestic workers that are able to stand on its own. Yeah, so a good model. So we go around the world and help also influence other policies, national and locally, yeah, internationally. So I think that in terms of campaign, of course, the ILO Convention 189, decent work for domestic workers, that's where actually we are focused on campaign in terms of international, and the support actually is important in our campaign. But of course, UK is that did even because the national law. How could they even do that? So it's a long struggle, but we are positive. We will win this. Thank you.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about relation to other unions, because here's for us a very special. Our little union is actually over 100 years old, and then in Sweden there's a big history of social democracy that it's connected to the central union mainstream union organization, and there is, I don't care about it, but historically there is some conflicts between the Irish Small Union and the major union, and today's situation is that the major union is not maybe succeeding addressing those problems of precarized workers. And we ended up finding ourselves in this niche where we work. We are like one of the only unions who work with that. And I quite often debate with those bigger unions about the importance of this problem, understanding it and being able to realize what is necessary in order to work with this kind of issues. And I don't find this understanding, which is actually quite irritating, that their approach is quite often that they would never help a person who comes to them if they're not a member or has not been a member in a special amount of time. And it comes from this old-fashioned approach that like everybody should know that they should be in a union because it's some kind of like a social solidarity contract. A nice thought, but it's not really realistic to expect that today when there's so many workers who cannot afford or don't realize that they have rights or cannot risk getting with a union. And it's very present in the situations where I work with many members who sometimes like in different situations their status as a migrant is connected to their status as a worker, so the visas, there's a lot of risk there in unionizing. And even in situations with European Union citizens that are able to stay here in Sweden, like I said before, there is so much dependency here. Sometimes, I mean, housing, economical, language, not knowing your rights, not having a social network, not having access to healthcare, and so on and so on. So it happened many times that when I start organizing with some workers, it's always their choice to join the union or not. I will give them all the information. But it happens many times that once they got in a union, they got fired. And quite often it happens that they lose housing from one day to another. They have to deal with migration services, tax offices, unemployment offices, like a lot of these different problems that can actually kind of spread outside of the formal, workers' rights or union scope of working. And as a union, you should, if you're working with that, you should be prepared to support that kind of a member, which we are trying to do. So it's creating like networks of help and finding ways to secure people. So if they end up in this risk situation, they are not left alone. But doing all that work, like I said, for me, it's quite big scope of different juridical work with all kind of institutions and so on. And different kind of jurisdiction always. You need resources, and the bigger union have those resources. So if they had a will and understand how to work with it, those resources really needed there to make organizing of precarious workers possible. And this is if you can really see it in a broader perspective and just not say blankly no or help to some extent and then just leave them alone. So that's quite a big problem, and I hope this can change sometimes because I'm working like on a voluntary basis, and it's taking all of my free time, and it's just that the problem is so big, and like more resources will be really needed. So those are the tensions. Like I think there is quite a lot of this critique from our part. A part of like the other jurisdictional areas that we work on, especially a lot of with housing. So we sometimes cooperate with the renters union, but it's again an old social democratic organization that is not always understanding those problems. And we do what we can. We cooperate quite a lot of, actually with the only organizations that understand this problem is social workers, who quite often become the organization that have to take care of those kind of problems. So we exchange a lot of information there and knowledge and help each other there. And there is something that it's also interesting that many of the old school unionists in Sweden see like undocumented workers or like black work, they say, as something that people should be like, it's their fault. If you're working under the table, it's your fault. You're doing something illegal. And this approach is quite it's quite annoying and I think quite stupid. So there need to be more broader understanding and change of a mindset in these bigger unions that got to they kind of got stuck in time in the 60s, 70s. So that's our problems with the major unions, basically.
I think we need unite the union to talk to them, to have dialogue with them. Yeah, so we don't have that kind of problem. We couldn't really complain and unite the union because they have done so much, adjustment. Yeah, to be able to for migrant domestic workers to be members of Unite the Union. Yeah,
I'm happy to hear. Can I flick in very short at Marisa? Just an anecdote. The major union actually created an organization that's called a union center for the the undocumented workers. So they have an alibi that they're actually doing it, but they didn't fund it. So they have no funding, and it's quite a few old guys, retired union reps who are running this organization by themselves, basically on their free time, and they're doing a shitloads of good work, and they're really annoyed at their unions as well. But it's kind of shows we acknowledge the problem, but we're not willing to put any resources in that. It's quite sad.
Yeah, but also I think one positive about the Voice of Movement, it is able to stand up on its own. So we really not dependent on United Union support. Yeah, because they have many. We can access everything, but we can stand on our own. Yeah, without But of course, we need in many ways, like in campaign, the building that they open for us is massive. You know how big is the building of Unite the Union? we can all use those buildings. Yeah, so I think we need to ask Unite the Union to have dialogue with trade unions worldwide, especially.
Yes, I'll get back to you about booking a room for a meeting.
I think when I think about what sex work and sex workers' rights organizing needs from labor unions, I always come back to this question of the narrative around sex work, and at least in a Canadian context and in so many other places too, this idea that sex workers need to be saved or rescued. And I think that in a lot of local organizing, that's been one of the biggest barriers to really engaging a lot of our labor unions in a meaningful way. Right? Because it's not just police or the state kind of coming in and trying to rescue or save sex workers. It's also we're also seeing a lot of narratives through our legal system, but also just through media, sort of telling people, other workers, that sex workers need to be rescued. And so I think from labor unions, there's a laundry list, money. We need money from labor unions and resources. But I think we also need to, in a local context, I think that we need to have more meaningful conversations around sex work as a form of labor and what that looks like. I think that locally in Toronto, our labor movement is quite stunted in that regard. I think that sometimes people have a very difficult time sort of seeing that transactional intimacy, that sex, but not always sex, because sex work is a wide range of things, right? So I'll just say a scale of intimacy. People have a very difficult time seeing believing that intimacy can sort of be bought and sold and negotiated, but that's a practice a lot of sex workers sort of regularly engage in. And, as much as our local movement and groups like Maggie sort of push this idea that sex work is work, sex work is legitimate work, and it very much is, it's also very unique in that when we're talking about sex, sexual labor, erotic labor, and intimacy, it's a very different kind of work than a lot of other forms of labor in our communities. And I think that can make it very difficult sometimes for labor unions to even want to engage with sex workers in the first place. I think that there's still a lot of shame and stigma. So if we even get a response back from our unions, like Maggie's, if we get a response back, we often don't. But if we do, there's one thing that becomes quite clear is there's a lot of education work there that needs to be done. And one of the things that I think is very important that I always say to labor unions, to labor organizers as well, because even on an individual level, just like talking about being a sex worker or a sex workers' rights organizer in labor organizing spaces doesn't really generate a lot of like respect, even from like progressive activists. And that's something that our movement really needs to work on and catch up with. But one of the things I always say in a local context, like in Canadian context, is that, you know, you can trace the evolution of most social movements back to the work and labor of sex workers. If we think about like the Stonewall riots, for example, that gave way to modern pride celebrations across like Canada and the United States, that was Black sex workers protesting gentrification, policing, and displacement in their communities, right? If we look at like a lot of mainstream feminist organizing locally in Toronto, pushing back against police violence, against rape culture, against sexual violence, sex workers were often ground zero for a lot of that. And because so many of our communities are so disenfranchised, it was on us to organize for ourselves and demand justice for ourselves and for our friends and for our families. We were the ones that had to organize search parties when our friends went missing. We were the ones that had to call police and beg them to even open missing persons investigations into our friends who had gone missing and had been murdered. So like sex workers' rights organizing really is, in a Toronto context, like at the core of so much progressive organizing, and our labor unions haven't completely caught up to that. And I think we still have a lot of issues of like representation within our labor unions. They still tend to be sort of dominated by like largely like old cis white men, which is not necessarily the demographic of a lot of workers who are most exploited in the workplace, right? And so there's definitely a lot that we need from labor unions that we're still just not getting because of these very degrading and stigmatizing narratives about sex workers that we have to push back against.
Thank you, Ellie, Daria, Marissa. Frank wanted also to intervene in this, so I will turn it over to him, and as before, I'll translate afterwards. In the schedule I had written till 11:15. I imagine this answer will take probably more towards 11:20. And if you're interested in having more questions, I'm here, but I don't want to take too much of your time, so we can maybe revisit that after Frank's answer and see if everyone's still available or if we should close the session. Frank, voulez-vous parler à cette question à propos des connexions aux unions nationaux, syndicats nationaux, et comment vous pouvez s'en servir de leur assistance? Qu'est-ce qu'ils pourront faire pour votre membre et votre communauté? Et comment organisez-vous d'une manière translocale ou transnationale?
Merci bien. J'ai écouté les interventions de nos sœurs, tout ce qu'ils ont parlé. La situation est telle que, comme je l'ai dit dans mon intervention, les problèmes que nous rencontrons de part et d'autre sont similaires. Nous avons presque les mêmes problèmes. Mais on a pu remarquer que le travailleur migrant et les migrants en général sont victimes de l'injustice sociale et des inégalités à cause de leur statut de migrants. Donc tout ça, ça pose problème. Et en ce qui concerne les travailleurs migrants, il y a des conventions internationales qui sont élaborées et mises en place pour défendre et protéger les travailleurs migrants. Malheureusement, ces conventions ne sont pas respectées et appliquées. Il y a même les conventions aussi de l'OIT. Donc, en dehors de la Convention internationale sur la protection des droits de tous les travailleurs migrants et les membres de leur famille, il y a les conventions de l'OIT qui sont là aussi pour essayer de protéger les droits des travailleurs migrants. Malheureusement, toutes ces conventions-là, la majorité ne sont pas respectées dans plusieurs pays au monde. C'est là où ça pose problème. On ne sait pas pourquoi, alors que les migrants sont des acteurs de développement, que ce soit pour leur pays d'origine, d'accueil et d'installation. Je me limite là, tu peux un peu traduire aux amis.
Merci Franck. Aussi, à l'après, si tu peux engager, je vais la traduire, mais si tu peux engager les thématiques aussi de relations contre les grandes et avec les grands syndicats et comment ils peuvent vous aider, comment ça a fonctionné, et organisation transnationale. Mais je vais la traduire directement. Frank listened and enjoyed the intervention, and he really feels that they're witnessing very, very similar problems in Morocco. He sees migrant workers in particular, but precarious workers more generally, as victims of social injustice, which is so paradoxical because in their everyday work, in their sending of remittances, in their supporting of communities, in their essential services, they are development actors. They are driving community sustainability and cohesion and resilience. Sadly, their precarity is enabled, according to him, by non-application of ILO conventions, national laws, particular regularization, and how these systems set up to defend them are, as Daria noted, often quite toothless, and they don't have the powers to meaningfully protect them. So this organizing around laws, and sometimes organizing socially, they've had better experience with social organizing. That was more answering to the earlier question, so I asked Frank to follow up on the union question. S'il vous plaît, Frank.
Oh. Oui, je disais ceci que, bon, en ce qui concerne les organisations syndicales, par exemple, ici au Maroc, donc il n'y a que l'ODT centrale. C'est la seule centrale syndicale marocaine qui a les migrants en son sein. Donc les autres centrales syndicales n'ont pas de migrants. Et nous, l'ODT immigré, nous sommes l'unique et le seul syndicat des travailleurs immigrés au Maroc. Donc il n'y a pas d'autres syndicats des travailleurs immigrés au Maroc à part l'ODT immigré. Donc les autres centrales syndicales n'ont pas des travailleurs, n'ont pas des travailleurs migrants. C'est l'ODT centrale qui est la seule centrale marocaine qui a les migrants en son sein. Et tout ce que nous faisons, comme les ont dit, comme l'a dit mes prédécesseurs, souvent nous travaillons bénévolement. On n'a pas de subvention ni de l'État ni quoi que ce soit. Donc nous travaillons bénévolement. C'est par conviction, c'est par volonté que nous avons décidé de faire ce travail. Et on le fait bénévolement. On ne gagne rien, mais on le fait parce que nous sommes contraints, nous sommes censés aider nos frères et sœurs qui sont dans les difficultés, y compris nous-mêmes. C'est comme ça que nous avons eu cette vocation-là de pouvoir aider nos frères et sœurs, travailleurs migrants, qui sont victimes de plusieurs sortes d'exactions. Donc c'est un travail que nous faisons bénévolement, sans rien en retour. Et on le fait par volonté et par conviction.
Merci Franck pour cette réponse précise et succincte. Speaking of the relation with larger unions, as you said a little about the British context, Marissa, they found a union, but that was the only union. So ODT is the only union in Morocco that enrolls migrants. There are many, many other unions that exclude migrants. In particular, they have a lot of the similar struggles also around financing and resources. Most of them work in a voluntary basis. And they see these larger unions that do not enroll migrants as keeping resources, absorbing resources, but also failing to engage meaningfully and enroll members of their community, members of these precarized professions. So you do see some of what we would describe as a sort of labor aristocracy. There's one train of profession that has the rights in the place, and then others that are working entirely on a solidaristic voluntary basis. And there is that resource that they could get from them. And this awareness and education gap that I think you've all signaled in different ways about recognizing the transversal connections of precarious work to other professions, how it impacts hotels, how it impacts housing, how it impacts other sectors, and is much more costly when you let people fall. So I really appreciate your answers to these questions thus far. But in the interest of fairness, I want to ask, would you like to have another question? Otherwise, we could close the session because we've gone 2 minutes over time already.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Sorry, audience, you don't get a vote. Okay, so I have another question from a colleague. He asked me to ask this because he couldn't be here, and he's written quite a lot about trade unionization and organizing precarious work, in particular, racism and sexism in trade union movements. So from Anders, he asked me to ask all of you, how he sees their role in relation to combating racism and sexism within their members of their unions and more broadly in the wider society, right? So both among members and then more broadly. And I think we'll have different levels of engagement for different parts of this question, but navigating the intersectional and diverse members that we see of complex origins, that of course there is prejudice. And Anders' research that informs this kind of question is he looks a lot around voters who might be said to be of racialized background who themselves vote for extreme right xenophobic political parties, and then looked also into unions in this question. So he asked me to ask this question to all of you, and I'd love if someone would like to engage with how they see combating sexism and racism within the rank and file membership of their different members. Yeah. Or in sensibilizing the racism and sexism to the wider society that might constitute their members. Please, Daria.
So when it comes to, I know maybe not everybody agree, but I have a rule. I don't talk politics with the members of that I'm working with, and it's because I have very specific kind of political view. I would put it like this: I would never allow any abusive situation to happen, and I would always, I kind of addressed it, but I avoid talking politics or special views on some questions, because if I would condition me helping other members on that, maybe there would be a very few people that I could actually help fighting the rights for. And what I notice is, as long as I don't have to bring it up, I don't have to preach. When we do stuff together with different workers, there is some kind of intersectional solidarity arising quite organically when people try to realize the different power structures that affect us in different ways. Which so I never had this kind of issues with the members of my union that I work with. So here I have no much more to say when it comes to racism and sexism that I have encountered in a union, labor law, rights context. It's that a funny thing, since as I mentioned, I wrote a book before I started organizing with others and being negotiator. So I noticed one thing, that when I was a migrant, a woman, and all the stories about my case maybe were in a newspaper, many people, a lot of unions, like a bigger unions, wanted to invite me for the meetings to talk about it. Lots of media was interested to talk to me, talking about my experience as a victim, and kind of like, oh my God, so horrible, working these conditions, being a migrant, a young woman, yada, yada. But when I started actually being an agent and working toward the change and actually talking about solutions and criticizing and talking about real concrete ways we could stop this, suddenly I was like, cut out from that sphere that before gave me a lot of space, to talk about my experiences. And suddenly when I was not a victim anymore, an agent, it changed. So it was very attractive to have a young woman who's a migrant talking about her experience as a victim, but not very welcome to being talking about her as an agent of change. So that's like, I thought it was quite interesting and quite disappointing here in Sweden, what happened to me with that.
Yeah, I think I know that I've been hearing as well a lot of complaints. I think we maybe managed to position ourselves very well within United Union, but I know the group also who left Unite and build their own union, as individual. So there's a lot of there's a hierarchy, political inside that. Politics inside that. There's a lot of that, but also sometimes we do monthly we do attend because we, as of now, we are part of the hotel workers now, because of the lockdown we haven't set up the domestic workers branch, but also that is very recent. This recent decided just at the end of 2019 we made that decision. We made that decision because of the difficult. You see that these big unions has so much can do so much, because they have everything. They have the resources, everything we need. So they should be the one to make adjustment to, and not the poor workers, vulnerable workers trying to fit into that big union, to be part of it. So I think what Unite the Union is, they are the one who adjusted. But we could see in terms of hotel workers, because in Jaboyson we are mostly women. I think we only have 10 men as members. We're mostly women. But if we go to hotel workers, they are mostly men. And it is actually a similar problem, but I think the difference is you found them in one building, one workplace, and domestic workers are individuals. So I think, but the way to assert, is not, if you want to win something within the United Union, is to be inside, like. I'm looking forward to be elected as council, so to have a stronger voice within the trade union, and I couldn't comment on why they separated, but I've seen them successful as well. But are they stronger being one small union rather than within a big, the big, within Unite the Union, which is the biggest trade union in the UK. So I couldn't say much about that, but we work with them even they get touch. But to me, I think the way to strengthen our position within Unite the Union is to be inside the union, and we continue to have a dialogue with all the higher, like, because we have Diana Holland, who is the Assistant General Secretary of Unite the Union, and she's very much into migrant domestic workers, but also Unite has Unite Community Branch, wherein those single mothers, undocumented, all those who couldn't afford to be a higher membership pay. So they only pay, I think, 50 per week. So it's that, but they also can access everything within, So, to position, to strengthen ourselves, I think we need to be inside to battle it. It's a long struggle. It is a big fight, but I think to win it is we have to be within inside. Thank you.
I think that this is such an important question, particularly on addressing things like racism and sexism in labor organizing. In a Toronto context, we have a lot of issues with anti-Black racism and sexual violence within progressive labor organizing spaces. And there's been quite a bit of conflict around how we talk about those things in open and honest ways, and what it means to have those kinds of difficult conversations in the context of like movement building. I think one common pushback that I think we get a lot is like pointing out these tensions, or pointing out where anti-Black racism or sexism exists, that breaks our solidarity, right? Because we're targeting out and singling out particular kinds of like workers within our movement, and that's not conducive to movement building. And I actually, we've met this a lot, right? Like I'm a Black woman and a sex workers' rights activist in a labor organizing space in Toronto. I've been met with this a lot. one of the things that I say back to that, and one of the reasons why I do think it's so important to consistently be talking politics and be doing that political education and re-education from people, is because I think that kind of like consciousness raising and like political education is a labor of love. Like it's difficult. It can be very tense. It can be very hard to explain to someone who maybe doesn't understand the politics of like anti-Black racism or transphobia. It can be very difficult to like confront someone and really unpack that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like one of my favorite writers is someone named Bell Hooks. And one of the things that she says a lot is like the effort and the energy and the labor that we put into like political education and consciousness raising, like that in and of itself is an act of love and respect and something that is conducive to movement building, right? Activism and struggling for social justice and human rights is about those things. And I think fundamentally, like if we exist within a labor organizing space that is racist, that Black people can't exist in comfortably, where migrants experience xenophobia and degrading remarks, where like trans women aren't respected or acknowledged or included in bargaining asks and campaigns, then who are we really building a movement for, right? And I think that like the important thing in that context, and it happens all the time locally, like the important thing when we see those issues is to raise them, right? It's to make them visible so that we can discuss and unpack and re-educate. And I think a lot about how groups like the Black Panthers combine things like mutual aid, but political education, but political re-education with people. Like if we're building a movement for social justice and human rights, like inevitably we're going to have to be able to name and confront very uncomfortable forms of harm within progressive spaces. I mean, one clear example I can think of, my background is in labor organizing, mostly within like post-secondary spaces. In 2015 at the University of Toronto, we were on strike. And one of the most pervasive issues we had on our picket lines was sexual harassment and sexual violence. And when we tried to go back to our union to say, listen, like, it is just not safe for women to be on our picket lines right now who are experiencing like sexual harassment or sexual violence. What we were met with from our union, it's a large labor union in Canada, CUPE, we were met with this sort of pushback around like, we're on strike right now and we need to be thinking about the goals of the union. We need to be moving forward as like one cohesive organization. And I always come back to this idea of like, listen, in 2015, if I can't go out onto a picket line without experiencing some form of like sexual violence or sexual harassment from someone else within my union, are we really organizing in solidarity together? Am I really expected to sit back and just keep that inside so that we can move forward together? Or does us moving forward at the expense of survivors mean that we're leaving an entire class of people behind? And that's how I see it when labor unions don't acknowledge organizations like Maggie's, because they don't believe that sex workers are real workers. They don't believe that sex workers deserve human rights or that we're smart or that we're good enough, right? Like we can't use this banner of progressive organizing or say that we're really showing up for workers if we're not showing up for all workers. Because the reality is that like workers are queer, workers are trans, workers are Black, workers are migrants, workers are sex workers. And if we're not building a labor organization or a movement that speaks to those people and that embraces those people, even if it means having very uncomfortable political conversations, then we're not really building a movement for anybody. And that's not a movement I want to be part of. So I love the idea of having these difficult conversations. I often do. It doesn't make me a lot of friends in local labor organizing, but it is very important. And I think that even if we don't get through to people in these initial conversations, as we often don't, it's uncomfortable to be like to have something you said wrong sort of named and confronted. Planting the seed is valuable. And it's just as important longer down the line. And if people are really committed to struggles for social justice and human rights, they should also be committed to improving themselves as well.
Thank you so much, Ellie. As you might have seen, we ran up against Daria's time, so she had to leave, and she asked me to apologize for leaving while you were answering, and thank you and Marissa and Frank for your comments, for listening, and for being a part of the discussion today. I think you brought up some really, really important points about how this old horizon that I think Daria talked a lot about of labor organizing that's invisibly a white guy, isn't what the working class looks like. It's not what your members looks like in any of the unions we're talking about, right? And if that's not what it looks like, its causes are not reflecting the needs of its members, right? There's a representational problem that I hear you really clearly seeing in what are the claims they're making for, what gendered and situational and specific spatial, what about this community's needs? So I think you brought up some really, really important points. And I'm very, very grateful for yours and Marissa's interventions today. We went over with that extra question, but I'm really glad that we did. But I think without Daria, it's maybe nice to close it down now rather than keep going without her. So I've been speaking English for a while. I'm just going to flip back and then come back again. Franck, je crois que peut-être tu as vu que Daria était obligée de quitter. On est arrivé à la limite de sa temps. Elle regrette ne pas dire au revoir elle-même et vous remercie beaucoup pour votre intervention, vos questions, vos discours. Vu que nous sommes loin maintenant, je crois que c'est un bon moment de clôturer la session et je vous remercie extrêmement pour votre participation aujourd'hui. Vous pouvez tout dire au revoir si vous voulez, mais je vous remercie fortement pour participer dans notre séminaire. S'il y a les questions pour vous d'après, je récolterai mon adresse mail est là. Okay. So, as I said just there at the end to Frank, if any of you would like to say any sort of closing remarks or farewells, you're more than welcome to. My email is attached to this event. So if there are questions for you, they can come to me so that you don't get, I'm happy to forward things and spam and ask you if you want to answer that question or want to be connected to it. And I'm very so grateful to all of you for participating today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ash, for organizing. Yeah, and thank you, Tabre. It's good to meet you all. Yeah, thank you. And to all our audience, thank you so much. It's okay you recorded it, right, Ash? So it's okay to public if that's what you mean.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and if you'd like a copy, I'd happily email you copies of the recording as well. Yeah. S'il vous plaît, Franck, je vous vois là.
D'accord, c'est juste pour vous remercier encore une fois pour l'organisation de ce séminaire. J'espère que ce n'est pas la première et la dernière, le premier ou le dernier séminaire. On aura encore l'occasion de nous voir dans d'autres séminaires. C'est très intéressant, ce n'est que le début. J'espère que nous puissions encore organiser d'autres séminaires parce qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on a à dire, mais le temps fait défaut. On n'a pas assez de temps, mais il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on peut dire concernant les travailleurs migrants, que ce soit ici au Maroc, que ce soit en dehors du pays, en dehors du Maroc. Donc beaucoup de choses sont à dire, mais le temps nous fait défaut. Donc c'est pourquoi il faut... cette initiative est à louer, je vous remercie vraiment. Donc, il faut multiplier ce genre de séminaires pour que nous puissions travailler en synergie, créer une dynamique au sein des associations des travailleurs migrants ou des syndicats pour que nous puissions défendre les causes de ces travailleurs migrants qui sont marginalisés de par le monde, qui sont discriminés, qui sont exploités, qui travaillent dans des conditions très difficiles parce qu'ils sont migrants. Alors que le migrant, comme je l'ai dit, est un acteur de développement de son pays d'origine, d'accueil et d'installation. Donc, même le Maroc a fait des avancées significatives dans le cadre de la migration, raison pour laquelle le Maroc est leader de la question migratoire en Afrique. Nous remercions Sa Majesté le Roi pour ses autres instructions, la régularisation, la stratégie nationale d'immigration et d'asile. Beaucoup ont été faits, mais beaucoup reste encore à faire au Maroc. Parce que les choses ne sont pas roses. Donc, que ce soit pour les Marocains, que ce soit pour les migrants, donc beaucoup reste encore à faire. Vraiment, ces genres d'initiatives sont à encourager. Je vous remercie beaucoup, vraiment, et je demande à ce que, après quelques temps, donc, nous puissions encore organiser ce genre de séminaire pour essayer de travailler en synergie afin de créer une dynamique pour la cause des travailleurs migrants à travers le monde. Merci beaucoup encore une fois. Merci aux participants et aux panélistes. Que Dieu nous protège pour que prochainement nous puissions nous rencontrer.
Thank you, Frank. Merci, Frank. Je vais la traduire brièvement, mais je ne peux pas donner toute la joie de ces gentilles paroles. Frank just wanted to say that he hopes there are further contexts and there is potential from this meeting and from these discussions to think together about these common conditions and how we can connect and help one another in different organizations. And that while there is good conditions and improvements have been made, there's always the work to do and we can't, put our hands down. So he's very grateful to be part of the session and thanks particularly the other panelists in the audience for making space. For those of you in the audience, if you are looking for more information about any of the organizations that Frank, Marissa, Daria, or Ellie are involved with, in the Facebook event for this event, there's links to all of those organizations. And you can also reach out and contact me personally and I'll send you in the right way. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.